Treasury payment systems. We could report.
Good afternoon, and thank you for joining our third event of the year. My name is Helen Hardacre. I'm the Reischauer Institute research professor of Japanese religions and society here at Harvard, and it'll be my pleasure to moderate today's session. The session today is sponsored by the Edwin O. Reischauer Institute of Japanese Studies, the East Asian Legal Studies at the Harvard Law School, and the Harvard Undergraduate Japan Policy Network. So deepest thanks to all our sponsors this afternoon. Our speaker today, Kenneth McElwain, is professor of comparative politics at the University of Tokyo's Social Science Institute. During the current academic year, he's serving as visiting professor of political science at Columbia University. And from 2005 to 2006, he was a postdoctoral fellow in the program on U.S.-Japan relations here. So it's wonderful to have him back with us today. Professor McElwain has published extensively on comparative political institutions, including constitutional design, parties and elections, and public opinion and international norms. He's the author of Nihon Koku Kenpo no Fuhen to Tokui, Sono Kiseki to Teiryo Teki Kosatsu, the universality and originality of the Japanese Constitution in Quantitative Perspective, published in 2022, which was the winner of the 44th Ishibashi Kanzan Book Award in 2023 and the 34th Asia Pacific Award Special Prize in 2022. His articles have been published in the Journal of Japanese Studies, American Journal of Political Science, the Review of International Organizations, and other journals. Most recently, he co-edited Pandemic to Shakai Agaku, Post-Corona Kara Miete Kurumono, or Pandemics and Social Science, Insights from Post-COVID Japan, published in 2024. He also has forthcoming co-authored articles such as The Double Bind Between Candidate Quality and Local Ties, a conjoint analysis of voter heuristics in the Journal of Politics. He's also working on a book manuscript titled Gaming Elections, Institutional Manipulation for Political Survival. Please join me in welcoming Kenneth McElwain.
Helen, thank you very much. Thank you, everybody, for coming today, especially to the U.S.-Japan program and bearing sponsors for making this talk possible. I started working on constitutions, as it turns out, 20 years ago when I was a visiting fellow here at the U.S.-Japan program. And when I was here, not just the U.S.-Japan program, officers and fellows and other postdoctoral visitors, but also Helen and members of the Reischauer Center were very kind to include me in their workshops. So I don't know if I'm going to be repaying the debt in a way that you want it to be repaid, but it's a delight to be able to talk about what I've been working on in recent years. I sent my slides last night. There's 180 of them. I will not be talking about 180 slides, but because what I want to talk about today is part of a broader book project, I do want to set the stage a little bit, which has to do with why we should care about constitutions. In some ways, living in a country where you don't have to worry about the Constitution is a blessing. It means things are publicly processed according to rules, norms are being followed. In varying ways, I think constitutions are under attack in a range of cases, and Japan is one where the debates over the Constitution have been active for much of the post-war period, but particularly in the last decade. And conceptually, we care about constitutions because we think constitutions can secure or save democracy. Democracy depends on the rule of law, but there may be disagreements about exactly how to interpret what the limits on state overreach are. At the same time, the political theorist Martha Schwartzberg warns of democratic autophagy. Autophagy is when organisms eat themselves effectively. The argument being that even within a democracy, there's a risk that the majority will vote to take away the wealth or rights of minorities. Constitutions are an attempt to improve democratic self-enforcement by, one, clearly enumerating how decisions are to be made, how political institutions are structured, which rights and duties the government is obliged to follow. And having it written clearly is a way to reduce uncertainty about what the limits of the state are. But the second, which is discussed more in legal studies, is the value of entrenchment. Instead of making everything decidable by majorities, creating supermajoritarian hurdles or agreement among multiple actors, such as local governments or through a referendum, makes it harder for fundamental rights and institutions to be changed. So this has been argued for a very long time. And I think a concept that has also been around for a while is, how do you ensure that the Constitution is abided by? And a recurring argument is that the endurance of constitutions depends on its legitimacy, meaning citizens must privilege adherence to the Constitution and be willing to punish actors who violate it, regardless of their partisanship or their self-interest. But the problem with legitimacy is it's a little bit like leadership or teamwork, right? These are concepts that I think we have a subjective understanding of. We see it when it seems to have legitimacy, or we see leadership, or we think we see leadership, but it's very hard to nail down. What we know from empirical studies about constitutional design and survival is that endurance, the survival of constitutions, is highly correlated with periodic amendments. Constitutions should adapt to new political priorities, economic inequalities, or simply changes in norms about what exactly the obligations of the state are. But there have also long been warnings that excessive revisions can weaken constitutional legitimacy. And excessive in this context is not necessarily the frequency of amendments, but rather the nature of certain amendments that seem to violate the core principle on which the Constitution was founded. In Japan, this is often discussed in the context of Article 9, which I'll come back to later. But Japan is an interesting case to study constitutional legitimacy for three reasons. The first is it is a very old constitution by global terms. It's ratified in 1946, so approaching 80 years. But importantly, it is the oldest unamended constitution in the world today. This figure that you see is a listing of current constitutions by how long it's been since they've been ratified. And there are two in red, Japan, 1946, and Denmark in 1953. These are the two unamended constitutions. So in that sense, Japan can be thought of as an outlier. The second is what I consider to be one of the dangers to constitutional legitimacy. The partisan battles over constitutional meaning and design has been heated, particularly over the last decade. It's involved the publication by the Liberal Democratic Party of its first constitutional draft in 2005, and on the 60th anniversary of World War II, again in 2012, on the 60th anniversary of Japan regaining sovereignty with the San Francisco Peace Treaty. More recently, the LDP has proposed 4 concrete amendment priorities since 2017, and different political leaders, Shinzo Abe being prominent, but also the picture of the LDP's election manifesto in 2024 in the most recent election with Prime Minister Ishiba, and they've consistently had a small section on the importance of constitutional change. And this theme tends to recur every year on May 3rd, which is Constitution Day, the day the Constitution came into force in 1947. We have pro-amendment groups, particularly by the LDP. This is former Prime Minister Kishida speaking to a pro-constitution rally. But it's not simply on the pro-revisionist side. There is, of course, active opposition to what is perceived as excessive amendment from those who prefer the status quo as well. And the third, and this really gets to the heart of what I want to talk about, is public opinion is crucial to constitutional change in Japan. First, Japan is one of, actually about 53% of constitutions around the world today have some kind of public input, whether in initiating constitutional change or in ratifying amendments. And Japan is one such case. But public opinion in Japan is fairly divided. The figure here is tabulates results from annual surveys on the Constitution by the Yomiuri, one of Japan's largest daily newspaper. The line in blue is the percentage that support amendment. In red is those who oppose it. And there are periods where support exceeds opposition, particularly in the early 2000s, which mostly involved disgruntlement with political institutions and democratic governance in Japan, which through legislative reforms faded to a large degree. But in recent years, support and opposition have been fairly roughly or evenly divided, with a slight surge in the last few years, beginning with COVID for the most part, in favor. So there's elite level debate that has been going on for a while, and the public seems evenly divided. And based on this idea of constitutional legitimacy, I've been working on a project with my longtime co-author, Chris Winkler, on understanding how constitutional legitimacy can be consolidated. What we mean by that is it possible or is it even desirable to amend the Constitution in a way to increase the degree to which people value adhering to its principles over other political or self-interested priorities? And we divide it into two dimensions. First is what we consider to be procedural legitimacy. This is something that legal scholars talk about the most, which is regardless of the content of any changes, is the process of amendment following both the law or the Constitution as it's currently designed, and is the nature of the debate in line with people's perceptions of what an open and free debate should look like. The second is a more political science question, which is the substance of the Constitution. What kind of amendments or what kind of Constitution do people perceive to be ideal? And is that in line with what is in the current text today? And so what I'll talk about and go through somewhat briefly is recent surveys and experiments that I've been doing with Chris, but also with other co-authors in this room, actually, on trying to understand constitutional design. And my main argument is there's a strong desire for, one, there is demand for greater constitutional debate. Two, that debate should be nonpartisan, or multi-partisan is a fair way of doing it. People prefer amendments that are proposed by multiple actors from different ends of the political spectrum, and they're particularly in favor of amendments that would increase the number of rights that are specified in the Constitution. But at the same time, and this is newer results, so I'll talk about it somewhat briefly, but there is a danger that even amendments, formal amendments to the constitutional text that people disagree with, if they are implemented through interpretive changes, people will come to accept it. So there's a backdoor to constitutional change, which people seem to accept, although from a constitutional legitimacy perspective, I have some questions about it. Okay.
Before you sit down,
I think most people here are familiar with the Constitution in general. I think people have seen the picture of MacArthur and Amber Hirohito before. There is a long debate about whether the Constitution, when ratified, was legitimate in the first place. One argument is that it was forced upon a defeated nation by the Allied powers, so kind of this, Oshitsukeno. The Constitution was forced on Japan. On the other hand, there are those who argue that this was in line with agreements from the Potsdam Declaration, and there may be questionable legitimacy about the current Constitution, but it's hard to say that an autocratic Constitution, the Meiji Constitution itself, had democratic legitimacy as well. So Chris and I are working on this as well. I'm going to skip over it today because I want to focus primarily on the amendment debate. And one fantastic resource for the amendment debate is Harvard's Constitutional Revision research project. And so I was just looking at it last night. There's a fantastic timeline that you can follow. Click on different documents to see how debates have evolved over time. So anybody interested in the Constitution, you may already know this resource, but I recommend it very highly. So I'll skip over the legitimacy of the ratification and instead focus on amendment. What form or process of amendment would people find more desirable? Now, there have been criticism that the constitutional amendment process in Japan, the legal process, is too onerous and arguably anti-democratic. Article 96, which is the amendment rule, writes that amendments first need to be proposed by 2/3 in both houses of the Diet, followed by a simple majority in a popular referendum. And conservatives, including Abe Shinzo, early in 2012, or in 2012, when the LDP returned to power, argued that Article 96 itself should be amended because having excessively high supermajoritarian hurdles means that a minority can block a change that the majority desires. So I've long argued with Chris that this argument has a number of holes. One is constitutions are meant to be counter-majoritarian. They are supposed to prevent the tyranny of the majority. So of course, it's going to be more than a simple majority. But first, most constitutions around the world, or many constitutions, use the same rule as Japan. According to data from the Comparative Constitutions Project, 2/3 of constitutions in the world today, 78% of constitutions in the world today require 2/3 in parliament. And about half of those also have a referendum requirement. So the Article 96 process is used among 35% of constitutions in the world. It is the most common combination. And the second, in a paper that I recently published with Shusei Eshima, who did his PhD at Harvard, myself, Ai Takahashi, who did her studies at the Kennedy School, and Chris Winkler have done public opinion on constitutional design, and we find that at least 56% of the public are okay with the current system. About 36% want to lower the Diet hurdle, but this remains a minority. So there isn't particularly strong grassroots support for changing the amendment rule itself. Now, that being said, there are proponents who want to push forward with constitutional change. And according to a survey by the Asahi in 2024, which asks, the LDP has proposed parties that they begin drafting amendments. Do you support or oppose moving forward? 59% say yes, and 30% say no. So people do want to see debates about specific constitutional changes. And this debate is most active in the Diet, at least at the elite level, in the Constitution Committee. And so there's a Constitution Committee on the Constitution in the lower house, the House of Representatives, and in the upper house, the House of Councillors. But in November 2023, it was one of the first open debates within this committee. And the LDP advocated what is long advocated, which is explicitly enumerating the self-defense forces in Article 9 as a new clause. On the left, the Constitutional Democratic Party argued in favor of restricting the powers of the Prime Minister to dissolve the lower house. But what has been new in recent years is a push for creating a new chapter on national emergency or state of emergency provisions. And this was proposed by a cross-party alliance between the LDP, the Komeito, the LDP's coalition partner, but also Ishin no Kai and the Democratic People's Party, Kokumin Minshito. And the fact that multiple parties were proposing the same ideas is notable because in work that I've done with Shusei Eshima and Chris Winkler, what we find is when voters are uncertain about the merits of constitutional change, they judge the quality of the proposal by who is proposing it, like the messenger as much as the message. So, and this paper was published a few years ago, so I'll summarize very briefly, but we took 12 different amendment proposals that were in the LDP's 2012 constitutional revision draft. So it's entirely LDP text. But we randomly changed who we said the proposer was to our survey respondents. Half the people were told it's an LDP proposal. The other half was told that it's drawn by an expert panel, Yushiki Sakai. And what we find is that when the proposal is described as being neutral, we see upwards of 5% support, additional support in favor of constitutional amendment, especially on adding new rights, to rights to privacy and environmental rights. On state of emergency in particular, independents increased their support for creating this new chapter by 8%. Among opposition party supporters, it was 9.5%. So it's a quite sizable increase in support. On the other hand, changing who the proposer is had no effect on LDP partisans and had no effect on Article 9. Meaning I think attitudes on Article 9 are fairly set in stone and hard to change. But on other issues, there's greater flexibility. But the fact that people want change is slightly different from whether or not the debate has really matured and it's possible to get consensus on exact constitutional amendment text. So in the same Asahi survey, they ask, do you think the momentum for constitutional change is growing among the public? And only 28% said yes, 70% said no. And we see this when we actually look at public opinion towards creating states of emergency. So this is in a project with my colleagues at the Institute of Social Science that we did on national emergency specifically. So one question we asked is, we asked people, are they in favor or opposed to about 10 different constitutional amendment ideas? One of them was strengthening the prime minister's power during national emergencies. Now, in the past, we've seen support for emergency powers increase during major natural disasters. It happened after the 3/11 triple disaster, and it certainly rose during the COVID-19 pandemic as well. And in our 2022 survey, so after COVID had really set in and different measures had been taken and debates had arisen about the appropriate limits on government powers, we found 52% of respondents said yes, there should be state of emergency powers in the Constitution. This is roughly in line with what media polls have found. But what we then asked is, so if you agree with state of emergency powers, what concrete powers do you think the government should have? They include vaguer concepts like take all necessary measures, which 42% of our respondents agreed with, make necessary fiscal expenditures, 38.8%, enact laws that restrict freedom of movement, an issue during COVID in particular, also 38%. Now, what the pro-state of emergency parties in the Diet have been arguing is what is most important is to allow for the extension of lower house terms. If there's a natural disaster or some crisis and it's not possible to have an election, you should be able to delay the timing of the election so that people nationally can vote in an orderly way. It turns out that only 17% of respondents agree with this. So there's a distinction between, on the one hand, people want more debate. There are a range of topics on which they express positive interest. But the debate hasn't entirely matured in the sense that when we go drill into the specifics, people are still very uncertain about the merits of many changes. So the first lesson, in a way, is the procedure matter. Right? Elite cues matter, especially on unfamiliar topics. And often in Japan, I describe this as Soron Sansei Kakuno Hantai. So there's an overall picture people like, the specifics not necessarily. Let me turn to the second major point, which is about substantive legitimacy. So as I began the talk with, legitimacy depends on the citizens' willingness to punish violations. But this depends on which violations citizens consider to be worth punishing. So the substance, the content of the Constitution should matter. Now, there have long been debates about what's wrong with the current Constitution. I won't go into much detail, but particularly on the right, on the conservative side, there's a sense that the Constitution is too Western or too liberal in thought, doesn't reflect Japanese values and traditions. I was at a conference at Tohoku University, and this is at Miyagi-Ken Gokoku Jinja. So it's in Sendai, and it's a temple up on the, or shrine up on the mountains. It's Date Masamune on the left, and on the grounds, there's a statement saying, let's create a beautiful constitution. Well, it's either let's create a beautiful constitution of Japan, or let's create a constitution of a beautiful Japan. So I don't know which part Utsukushi is moderating, but let's make this quickly. So on the pro-revision side, across multiple fora, there are calls for amendments. This didn't show up very well. Shinto Association of Spiritual Leadership has a very snazzy constitutional amendment proposal pamphlet that they advertise as well. But there are also arguments that the substance of the Constitution is already legitimate. And this is something I've spent a lot of the last few years working on. One is the Constitution in Japan is actually very short and leaves many things to be determined by law. The median Constitution, when translated into English, is about 22,000 words long. So you get all the constitutions of the world, you translate it into English, it's about 22,000 words long. The longest constitution is the Indian Constitution, which is 146,000 words long. The American Constitution is about 9,000 words long. The Japanese Constitution is 4,900. It's the fifth shortest constitution in the world. And it's short in the sense that it leaves many details to be determined through legislation, especially on political institutions. So even though the Constitution has formally never been amended, there have been quite substantive changes in Japanese governance over the last 70 years. At the same time, the Constitution of Japan enumerates a large number of rights, which puts it in line with most global standards. I'll be happy to talk about this in greater detail if you're interested, but in a paper with Shusei and Ai Takahashi and Chris Winkler that I first presented in 2019 when Shin kindly invited me to give a talk at Harvard. It took 5 years to get published, but it is now published at the International Journal of Constitutional Law. We use a series of experiments to show that, not talking specifically about the Constitution of Japan, but when you ask people, what constitutions do you consider to be ideal? People strongly prefer constitutions that have more rights. So are there concrete amendments that can increase cross-partisan legitimacy in Japan? So this, again, is a result of a series of surveys that I've done with various co-authors. This is the Yomiuri data, again, that I showed at the beginning, where public opinion is fairly divided with an increase in support. Now, the problem with a lot of media surveys is they would ask the question, are you in favor of constitutional revision or not? But I understand why they question it that way, but the normal answer is, well, it depends on what you want to amend. So with my team, we've been asking more bespoke survey questions about people's attitudes towards constitutional change. And this is our result from our survey last March. So we asked for people's opinion on, for example, do you think the Constitution should be amended to include privacy rights, rights to live in a clean environment? Should the Supreme Court be supplemented with a special constitutional court? Should tertiary education be made free? What about enumerating the self-defense forces in Article 9, empowering the prime ministers during state of emergency, restricting the prime minister's dissolution powers, and weakening the power of the House of Councillors? So I've shown this data in kind of three ways. The first is the overall support for each of these amendments. And if it's greater than 50%, I've shaded it in green. I've next shown the percentage who support this among those who identify as LDP supporters and everybody else. That's the LDP, which is 18% of our sample, and non-LDP, which is 82%, and then the difference between these two. What we see is there is support across party lines for adding the rights to privacy and to living in a clean environment. And I've done this survey over 5 years, and consistently there is bipartisan support in favor. By contrast, those that are pushed by just one end of the political spectrum, so enumerating the self-defense forces, has strong support among LDP partisans, but very low among non-LDP groups. And so I think the rightmost column is most instructive, is that on many issues, there's almost no partisan divide, but on Article 9 and state of emergency, the gap is greater than 20%. So perceptions of legitimacy of including these amendments varies quite significantly in a way that certainly Chris and I think poses a risk to constitutional legitimacy. So there are variants of this that we've done over time. But what I want to end with is this question of alternative pathways to changing the meaning of the Constitution. What we see around the world is if formal amendments are difficult, the same outcomes are pursued at different levels of government. So in federal countries like the United States, changing the federal constitution may be difficult, but state level constitutions are subject to much more frequent amendment. But more commonly, amendments are done through reinterpretation, either by government actors, by elected politicians, or through the courts, the judiciary. Now, interpretive changes lack clear legitimacy, especially when compared to a voter referendum. So this raised the question, would the public accept interpretive changes they oppose via amendments? And Article 9 probably fits best. And the debate that I'm particularly interested in, I think many of you have followed, is concerning the reinterpretation to permit limited collective self-defense. So historically, Article 9 was interpreted by the Cabinet Legislation Bureau to mean that Japan can possess minimum necessary levels of self-defense that does not constitute war potential. But the 2014 Cabinet Legislation Bureau reinterpretation allows for this new form of limited collective self-defense, where Japan can use force to prevent an armed attack on a close foreign partner, even if Japan itself is not directly attacked. And one argument in favor of it is this is a right that is notionally conferred by the UN Charter as well. The security legislation that passed in 2015 wrote that minimum actions, including self-defense force deployment to secure Japan's survival, may be permissible when there are no other means to repel attack. Now, this raised significant protests on the streets in Japan. It took over Diet deliberations for a number of months as well. But one curious finding is, again, this is surveys from Asahi. In 2015, right after the security legislation passed, 51% believed that it violated the Constitution. 22% said it did not violate. So there was strong opposition. 6 months later, support was about the same, but 38% say they don't think it violates the Constitution. March 2017, it's half and half. So many people who thought it was in violation have come to accept it. There are two ways of thinking about this. One, or rather, there's a specific theory about this that social psychologists call system justification theory, which is that people defend existing systems even when they consider it to be flawed, because they want to reduce uncertainty and increase satisfaction with the status quo. One interpretation is this means that people will oppose any changes to the status quo. But the second is if you change it anyway, then the new change to the new status quo, and people will continue to push and defend that. So with my colleague at the law faculty at Todai, Sakaya-san and Yosuke Shinohara at Kobe University, we've been doing some surveys that try to understand what influences people's beliefs about the constitutionality of security policies. And importantly, we expect people to consider policies they like to be constitutional, but we want to measure these things separately. So what you like as opposed to what you consider to be constitutional. Are they the same or not? And we have some treatments that show different kinds of information that I'll show you very quickly. So we first ask our survey respondents, do you think Japan should allow the following policy measures? Do not worry or do not consider whether you think it's permissible under the current constitution. Just are you in favor or against? And we asked 9 different policies: alliance with the United States, maintaining self-defense forces. We're particularly interested in the middle 3, 4, 5, and 6. Limited collective self-defense, possession of counter-strike capabilities, and export of weapons with lethal capabilities. These are, in a way, the changes that are being deliberated or have been implemented most recently. Then we ask people, for the same set of items, do you think these are permissible under the Constitution? So this is what we consider our control group or our baseline. So one quarter of respondents saw this question. Another quarter were additionally told that for policy measures that have already been implemented by the government, the timing of their introduction is already indicated. So we told people which ones have already been implemented or not. We showed some other people the text of Article 9, in case they weren't familiar with the text. And then there's a fourth group where we did both. We showed the date of implementation and text of Article 9. Sorry, this is it in Japanese if you guys would like to see. This is the result, and I apologize, the numbers are a little bit small here. But what we find is that, for example, on the US alliance, 83% like the policy, 85% think it's constitutional. On self-defense forces, 90% like having self-defense forces, 80% consider it constitutional. There are also a range of things where people dislike it and they consider it to be unconstitutional. Those are on the far right. So for example, possessing nuclear weapons or conscription are things that are get less agreement on both sides. But the interesting gap is on limited collective self-defense, counterstrike, and export lethal weapons. For example, on limited collective self-defense, 70% think that the policy is good, but only 51% think it's constitutional. On counterstrike, 70% are in favor of the policy, only 41% think it's constitutional. So it looks like people differentiate what they like from what they consider to be constitutional. This graph, I think, maybe more succinctly summarizes the difference between preference and constitutionality. So that the more positive the number, the more people like it, but think it's not adhering to the Constitution of Japan, and its highest amount of counterstrike, 30% gap, collective self-defense, 20%, and full collective self-defense is also 19%. So what happens when we show them the information about when the policy was implemented? And so we use different treatments, so there are different ways of showing it. This summarizes the main result. This plots the average difference in belief in the constitutionality of the policy when shown information about when the policy was enacted, or if it was enacted at all. So a positive number, so each marker is a point estimate. It's a predicted estimated percentage change in belief in its constitutionality. The bars are confidence intervals. You can think about them as ranges of uncertainty. And if the bar does not cross zero, we consider it to be statistically significant by conventional measures. And what we find is limited collective self-defense, where the baseline support is 51%. That's in yellow. Being told it has already been implemented increases support by 8% relative to people who weren't told that it's already been implemented. On counterstrike, it's about 11% increase in support. Export lethal weapons is about 7%. So what it looks like, and I swear I'm coming to an end now, is there are three lessons that, at least from the studies that I've done, we think we know about the Constitution. One is on the process of constitutional change, there seems to be greater support for changes if they are done in a nonpartisan or at least a bipartisan manner. The second is there's active elite disagreement on pro-anti-amendment. But among the public, there seems to be cross-partisan support for adding new rights. But third, and perhaps more dangerously, even if partisan changes are disliked by the public, there is a risk that once implemented, people will come to accept it as a new status quo. And so what I would take away from this, and what I'm working on with Chris, is returns to, I never should talk about this picture. It's a Ouroboros. So it's a snake that eats its own tail. It's a snake eating constitution. It took about 20 minutes to make this on ChatGPT. But one thing that I think Chris and I both believe is reflexive opposition to amendments may be counterproductive. That's not what it looks like the public wants. There is openness to constitutional amendments as long as procedural input and substantive menu of amendments are diversified. What we don't know is how can we deepen these debates productively without getting it sucked into broader partisan electoral conflict that I think has long characterized elite discourse on constitutionalism. And the last one I'll end with is collectively, especially in the political science sense, we know a lot about public opinion towards Article 9. We actually don't know very much about people's attitudes towards new rights. Do you want a right to privacy? Sure, a lot of people say yes. But what do they consider to be the rights of privacy, especially in this digital era where one voluntarily shares information or one is unaware of how much information one is sharing? So these are things that we hope to keep on working on. And I've gone on a little bit long, but I welcome your comments and input. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for a really stimulating talk. We'll turn now to a question and answer period. But please note that we plan to post the video of this seminar online, and audience questions will be included in the video. So we'll now turn to our postdoctoral fellow and Kenneth's co-author, Saki Kuzushima, to pose her opener question. Her project this year is titled Information Transmission from International Organizations to the Public. Please.
Thank you so much for the introduction, and thank you so much for so I have like one question about the knowledge of the citizens when they ask about the constitutions, because the constitution is like a very complex topic. So I was wondering to what extent that information people have already explained some of the information you have. So specifically, I found the result about like soil something like the people agree on the big change on the national emergency clause and the specific disagreement. It's kind of interesting because I was wondering,
Helen
it's a
Hardacre.
big one.
Look at the big coat.
Actually more risky because it's subject to many. So I was wondering, that kind of result will change based on the people, or do you think if, providing more information about
Helen
what
wants to come and take you up to
what people think about otherwise.
Linda.
Thank you.
Linda.
Could I show the screen again really quickly, or? Saki, thank you very much. So in most of our surveys, we actually try to assess how much people know about the Constitution. The only problem is that there are different ways of thinking about knowledge. So this happens in surveys about American politics or politics in any country as well, which is in our surveys, we tend to ask, for example, which clause in the Constitution, which article in the Constitution prevents the right of war, or which article concerns amendment rules. And we ask people to match the number to the information. Or we ask, what are the three major principles of the Japanese Constitution? So these are things that you learn in school or you read in newspapers. But they're quite factual information, and it's not clear if knowing the factual information is more important than understanding constitutionalism in a broad sense. So with the caveat that there are limits to how we can measure it, it does look like, so we do try to measure it. And what we generally find is things like treatment information. So for example, showing the effect of when a particular change to Article 9 or a new policy related to Article 9 has been implemented, it has a stronger effect on those who are less knowledgeable about the Constitution, or who have less factual knowledge about the Constitution. And I think we expect this in that we're more likely to be introducing new information to those who follow the information less. But I think your question about the state of emergency is something that honestly I found very surprising as well. So I've worked with different political parties or different groups about constitutional change, especially as state of emergency became a hot topic. And we had expected that vaguer powers, like the government should be able to take all necessary measures or should be able to make any necessary fiscal expenditures, would be extremely unpopular. But they turn out to be more popular than clearer guidelines like lower house dissolution or penalize those who don't agree. And I don't know to what extent this reflects let them do whatever is necessary. We don't want to have, we don't want to pen them into too narrow of a guideline, or people really believe that they can trust the government in doing this. But there's a broader issue related to state of emergency provisions, which is support for this is extremely volatile because it really depends on how much people trust the government. There is a crisis. We need to give the leader more power. It's possible that the crisis is caused by the leader, or the crisis has become worse because the leader is unable to resolve it. Are these situations where you want the leader to have more power? And COVID was a time where, while there was some increase in giving the national government more power, there was more support for giving local governments more power, because many people trusted their governors more than they trusted the national government. So one is there's highly contextual variance. People's experiences matter. Knowledge matters to some extent. A lot of these things are moderated by a combination of knowledge and trust in the government. That's a much longer and different answer than you may have expected, but.
Yes, may I ask that people with questions please state their name? Thank you.
Thank you, Kenneth. My name is Fumio Uchikoshi. I'm an academic scholar at the Hardacre Center. So my question might be a bit similar to Saki's question. But I was kind of surprised to see, in a sense, that it seems like many people in Japan, they have some say, they have some opinion about constitutions. Like when you show a Yomiuri survey, basically like a 50% people in favor, then like a 40, sometimes like a 30% people say no. Then it seems like many people, they have some sort of opinion. Is it because do people do really think about constitution carefully every day, or is it because more due to how the survey was kind of designed? Like it's kind of binary question, yes or no. Then I assume that the Yomiuri or other survey responded to say either yes or no. So
Yes.
then but my prior maybe like is that the majority, not majority, but sizable people, maybe they never thought about constitution. Maybe they say like they don't care, they are not interested in those issues. So that was my prior. So then the question is, to what extent do we need to consider those potential ambiguity or ambivalence or the lack of interest in those issues?
Thank you. So as an example, at least in the survey set, so this is the Yomiuri survey. Yomiuri asks yes, no, don't know.
Yeah.
So there's no middle answer per se. There's a don't know, which can be interpreted in a number of different ways. But one thing that's changed in the Yomiuri, it's hard to see from here, but until about 2010, 20% of respondents said don't know. In the last 5 years, that percentage is below 10%. One thing that has changed is they've moved their survey mode from mail-in surveys to telephone surveys. So there is that difference that could be causing the effect. But I think particularly with increased constitutional debate during the second Abe administration and onwards, most people at least have some vague sense in favor or opposed. But I think this also maps on to some degree with partisanship and other factors. In the surveys that I run, for the most part, when I show things like the percentage of people who say yes, we ask, are you in favor, neutral, or opposed? And this is the percentage that say yes. So it's yes versus neutral and no. So I think this is closer to a true yes of people who think that these amendments are good.
Is there any option for don't know? Or
There
don't
is.
care?
There's always a don't. It's actually a 5-point scale with the don't know option.
It's kind of surprisingly low to me.
Ah.
I would say many people say they don't really know, they don't care. That was my intuition. So I was kind of surprised to see that. Many people seems like have some say either yes or no. That was my kind of.
It's worth exploring further. Thank you. And it relates to the knowledge
It's kind
question as
of
well.
far correlated with people's knowledge. I guess.
Yes.
But thank you.
Professor Nakano.
Thanks, Kenneth. I have two questions. I tried to sort of frame them as briefly as possible. But, the first one is to do with the, because I also do research on constitution and I have my own sort of strong opinions about it too, as you know, for sure. So, I mean, from my sort of approach, I'll be approaching it more on a kind of philosophical and historical way. And I appreciate the comparison that you do, but I'm very skeptical whether you can actually compare in that kind of flat manner, in the sense that the Constitution is not like an objective entity that existed for as long as humanity, like our eyes exist. And what I mean by that is, of course, the Constitution is something that Japan was in that way imposed upon at the Meiji period in order to be acknowledged in the family of nations, as it were. And of course, Britain, the United States, among other countries, were the ones who said, you are not civilized enough. You need to have a constitution, you need to have the rule of law. Otherwise, we are not going to, get rid of the extraterritoriality, right? And so the constitution, and of course, Japan ended up with a Meiji constitution, which is the oldest constitution in Asia. And so looking at, I don't know about the Irish constitution, but looking at, for example, Britain doesn't have a constitution. It gets away with it. America has this old, crappy constitution. I look at it, I'm saying, amend it already. But there's no debate. Somehow Japan is being told that, oh, your constitution is too old. But looking at the history of the Japanese constitution or constitution in the non-West, it is also about repelling imperialism and imposition by the West to dictate what we do. And even in the post-war period, we ended up with this constitution, in some ways, for sheer luck, excessive idealism on the part of the New Dealers and so forth, which they soon come to regret. And of course, America was the first to say, oh, Article 9, get rid of it. And so from my point of view, of course we resist. Of course we're going to say no, because it's about our own democracy. So in a way that is very different from the constitutional debate in which you can have the luxury of not having a constitution, or you can say, oh, our constitution is just fine. And so that is sort of, I think looking at this kind of historical background to this even objective looking, the idea of the constitution, it's not just about the length and so forth, but the historical background is entirely different for many countries in the non-West. And I think we need to put that into consideration. The second point is a little bit related, and it's also about this idea about, Soron Hanta and Kakuron Sansei and your own conclusion, which I have to say I disagree with, is to do with the fact that, of course, the idea of the need to revise the constitution and need to be constructive in deepening the debate, you can actually say the same thing about the current debate that Trump started or restarted about, for example, reforming the university. And, we need to, when people say, of course, like Harvard too, universities in America need to be reformed. Yeah, there are lots of problems. But when you have these people saying that and knowing what they want out of it, are you going to actually join the debate and say, okay, let's look, work constructively? I mean, I'm sure some do. But others, people were going to say, don't touch it for now anyway, because the kind of, partisan climate that you say is counterproductive, it's not going to go away by people who are put on the defensive, by people who are very powerful and whose intent is to destroy it for their own purposes rather than to actually make it better. So what do you say to that?
Thank you, Coach. It's good to see you again, and great to have this debate with you. So one thing that's changed about constitutions around the world is simply that every country except for the British, and depending on how you measure it, New Zealand and Israel, have a written constitution, this master text that serves as the constitution. Japan has one, Ireland has now on a second constitution, North Korea has one, Saudi Arabia has one. Whether it's followed or not is a different guideline, but as a signal of modern nation state, you're exactly right. I think our book and parts of our slide earlier, which we didn't go into, was about debates concerning the ratification of the Constitution in the first place. That will go back to the Meiji Constitution as well. And maybe we can talk about that a little bit separately, because it's also a longer argument. But I found, in a good way, provocative, the question about whether it's meaningful to have or possible to have a constructive debate about the Constitution. I think there's a normative question and a more strategic question on this. And at least for this project, what Chris Winkler and I have in mind is this broader question about constitutional legitimacy as a public good, and how can we further it? And is the nature of the current debate productive or counterproductive? And from that perspective, again, from a more normative angle, we would argue, I think for the reasons that I've discussed, that there is hunger for constitutional debate, but it needs to be done in a certain way. And that's multi-partisan or bipartisan or non-partisan, with a broader menu of options to choose from. But I agree with you, and where I think we need to do more work is understanding how to bring it there. Right? So doing surveys and measuring public opinion it's not difficult in the sense that there are ways to do it. Political science knows how to do it. Sociologists know how to do it. But over time, we've come to realize that we don't actually know how to convince politicians. If public opinion changes, political actors preferences will also change on the margins. But I think on attitudes like constitutionalism, which are deeply ideological, there are politicians who are more flexible on these matters, but I think it's baked into the core of what a political party is, in the same way that imperial succession or other such matters are also baked into party identities. And I mean, honestly, I would love to talk about this with you further because I think we work with different kinds of political actors and there's a tactical dimension that's different from the normative. But I believe strongly that open debate is good. We just need to figure out how to do it. And as we lurch towards finishing this book, perhaps we'll come upon an answer somewhere along the way.
Professor Howell?
Yes, thanks very much for your talk.
Thank you.
I was wondering when you were talking about how sort of substantive changes that had already been enacted were more likely to be seen as constitutional than ones that were still hypothetical. I mean, one thought that occurred to me was that, well, maybe some people think that someone has checked, someone who knows what is constitutional or not, has checked and has decided that these new laws are constitutional, and therefore, who am I to doubt that?
Yeah.
And therefore, I might be more likely to agree that it's constitutional, which then, of course, prompts the question of, well, who's checking? How do people think about the question of constitutional interpretation?
Yep.
Of course, as we all know, in the United States, the Supreme Court is the very center of all debates about the Constitution, ways that people like or don't like, depending on the issue. But how many Japanese people can name even a single Supreme Court justice in Japan?
Almost none.
Right. And so, even just at a conceptual level, how do people think the Constitution or other laws are interpreted, and what kind of legitimacy that interpretation has?
Thank you. So we've thought a lot about what it means when you are told that something is done. Now, one reasonable interpretation is if it's being done, then it must be legal or somebody would have raised a stink. And if I haven't heard about it, then it's probably okay. So it must be valid. And I think that underlies the system justification angle in some ways. It's also dangerous when thinking about constitutional legitimacy because, again, the classic argument is a clear constitution lays out what's permissible and not permissible, and voters will be able to decide, or social groups can decide what is legitimate and not. But if those decisions are being outsourced and there's an expectation that you'll see smoke if something is wrong, is not being met, then there's a complacency that can build in more change that I think people are truly comfortable with. So now in practice, the Japanese Supreme Court is more active on social issues, particularly increasingly on matters relating to family and gender. It is not good, for the most part, not going to get involved in, I think, any security-related matters. I think it's seen as a political question rather than a judicial question. But one thing we have started looking at is trying to understand when court decisions are legitimate. Because reinterpretation can either be a formal process that goes through judicial review, and varying courts make judgments and offer an argument. Or it could be the government just saying, this is what we're going to do. And I think the Article 9 related changes or the security legislation is more the latter. So it hasn't gotten nonpartisan expert advice. This is partially why I think there have been arguments in Japan of creating a special constitutional court that can focus on these matters. And we're trying to understand how people think about the courts themselves. This is something that legal scholars really care about, is do voters even know how courts work? It's like insurance companies. You only get to know them when you're in a bad place. So, but what we've looked at, and we've been, again, kind of similar surveys for a while, and maybe I deleted it here, is you can see all the slides. I have all these manga that the MDP draws to convince people to have a constitutional revision. Here we go. We asked people which political or state institutions do you trust? And we asked people on a 5-point scale. And this is a percentage who say that they are weakly or strongly trusting of these institutions. And what we find is there's the non-elected actors do a lot better than the elected actors. So the emperor is 72%, SDF 68, Supreme Court is 63, the cabinet is 19, central bureaucrats are 25%, local bureaucrats is actually 30%, and then local government is 41. Now, this survey, so this is March 24, was a time when cabinet approval was particularly low. And so there's ebbs and flows that depend on the popularity of the leader. But I think the Supreme Court itself seems to be fairly trusted. If things are interpreted through the Supreme Court, I think I feel more comfortable about the legitimacy of the decision that's being made. But currently, it's hard to prove, it's hard to sue the government for anything related to security matters because it's hard to show that you've been adversely affected by it, which I think makes it even more important to have the broader debate.
I'm sorry, I know there are more questions, but we are out of time at this point. So please join me again in thanking Professor Malcolm